Well, now is as good a time as any. Let's get started, shall we? All right. Tonight we are starting Peter Pan in Kensington Garden by J.M. Barrie. Yeah, I think the cord maybe is busted. I'm going to put on a timer on my phone that I take a short rest after 15 minutes, as soon as I can get my thing to work. Alrighty. Here we go. Part 1. The Grand Tour of the Garden. David, you must see for yourselves that it will be difficult to follow Peter Pan's adventures unless you are familiar with the Kensington Gardens. They are in London, where the king lives, and I used to take David there nearly every day unless he was looking decidedly flushed. No child has ever been in the whole of the gardens, because it is so soon time to turn back. The reason it is soon time to turn back is that if you are as small as David, you sleep from 12 to 1. If your mother was not so sure that you sleep from 12 to 1, you could most likely see the whole of them. The gardens are bound on one side by a never-ending line of omnibuses over which your nurse has such authority that if she holds up her finger to any one of them, it stops immediately. She then crosses with you in safety to the other side. There are more gates to the garden than one gate, but that is the one you go in at. And before you go in, you speak to the lady with the balloons, who sits just outside. This is as near to being inside as she may venture, because if she were to let her go, her hold of the railings for one moment, the balloons would lift her up and she would be flown away. She sits very squat, for the balloons are always tugging at her, and the strain has given her quite a red face. Once she was a new one, because the old one had let go, and David was very sorry for the old one. But as she did let go, he wished he had been there to see. The gardens are a tremendous big place, with millions and hundreds of trees. And first you come to the figs, but you scorn to loiter there, for the figs is the resort of superior little persons who are forbidden to mix with the commonalty, and is so named according to legend because they dress in full fig. These dainty ones are themselves contemptuously called figs by David and other heroes, and you have a key to the manners and customs of this dandiacal section of the gardens when I tell you that cricket is called crickets here. Occasionally a rebel fig climbs over the fence into the world, and such a one was Miss Mabel Grey, of whom I shall tell you when we come to Miss Mabel Grey's gate. She was the only really celebrated fig. We are now in the Broad Walk, and it is as much bigger than the other walks, as your father is bigger than you. David wondered if it began little and grew until it was quite grown up, and whether the others' walks are its children. And he drew a picture which diverted him very much of the Broad Walk, giving a tiny walk, and airing in a perambulator. That means pram. In the Broad Walk, you meet all the people who are worth knowing, and there is usually a grown-up with them to prevent them going on the damp grass, and to make them stand disgraced at the corner of a seat if they have been Mad Dog or Mary Annish. To be Mary Annish is to behave like a girl, whimpering because nurse won't carry you, or simpering with your thumb in your mouth, and it is a hateful quality. But to be Mad Dog is to kick out at everything, and there is some satisfaction in that. If I were to point out all the notable places as we pass up the Broad Walk, it would be time to turn back before we reach them, and I simply wave my stick at Jekko Hewlett's tree, that memorable spot where a boy called Jekko lost his penny, and looking for it found 2 pence. There has been a good deal of excavation going on there ever since. Farther up the walk is the little wooden house in which Marmaduke Perry hid. There is no more awful story of the gardens than this of Marmaduke Perry, who had been Mary Annish 3 days in succession, and was sentenced to appear in Broadwalk dressed in his sister's clothes. He hid in the little wooden house and refused to emerge until they brought him knickerbockers with pockets. You now try to go to the Round Pond, but nurses hate it because they are not really manly, and they make you look the other way at the Big Penny and the Baby's Palace. She was the most celebrated baby of the gardens, and lived in the palace all alone, with ever so many dolls. So people rang the bell, and up she got out of her bed, though it was past 6 o'clock, and she lighted a candle and opened the door in her nightie, and then they all cried with great rejoicing, "Hail, Queen of England!" What puzzled David most was how she knew where the matches were kept. The Big Penny is a statue about her. Next we come to the Hump, which is the part of the Broad Walk where all the big races are run. And even though you had no intention of running, you do run when you come to the Hump. It is such a fascinating slide down kind of place. Often you stop when you have run about halfway down it, and then you are lost. But there is another little wooden house here called the Lost House, and so you tell the man that you are lost, and then he finds you. It is glorious fun racing down the Hump, but you can't do it on windy days because then you are not there, but the fallen leaves do it instead of you. There is almost nothing that has such a keen sense of fun as a falling leaf. From the Hump, we can see the gate that is called after Miss Mabel Grey, the fig I promised to tell you about. There were always two nurses with her, or else one mother and one nurse, and for a long time she was a pattern child who always coughed off the table and said, "How do you do?" to the other figs, and the only game she played at was flinging a ball gracefully and letting the nurse bring it back to her. Then one day she tired of it all and went mad dog, and first, to show that she really was mad dog, she unloosened both her bootlaces and put out her tongue east, west, north, and south. Then she flung her sash into a puddle and danced on it till dirty water was squirted over her frock, after which she climbed the fence and had a series of incredible adventures, one of the least of which was that she kicked off both of her boots. At last she came to the gate that is now called after her, out of which she ran into streets David and I have never been through. We have heard them roaring, and still she ran on and would never again have been heard of had not her mother jumped into a bus and thus overtaken to her. It all happened, I should say, long ago, and this is not the Mabel Gray whom David knows. Returning up the broad walk, we have on our right the baby walk, which is so full of prams that you could cross from side to side, stepping on babies. But the nurses won't let you do it. From this walk, a passage called Bunting's Thumb, because it is that length, leads into Picnic Street, where there are real kettles and chestnut blossoms fall into your mug as you are drinking. Quite common children picnic here also, and the blossom falls into their mugs just the same. This book is called Peter Pan in Kensington Garden. Thank you for joining us, Jimbo Beezy. Next comes St. Govor's Well, which was full of water when Malcolm the Bold fell into it. He was his mother's favorite, and he let her put her arm round his neck in public because she is a widow. But he was also partial to adventures and liked to play with a chimney sweep who had killed a good many bears. The sweep's name was Sooty, and one day, when they were playing near the well, Malcolm fell in and would have been drowned had not Sooty dived in and rescued him. And the water had washed Sooty clean, and now he stood revealed as Malcolm's long-lost father. So Malcolm would not let his mother put her arm round his neck any more. Between the well and the round pond are the cricket pitches, and frequently the choosing of sides exhausts so much time that there is scarcely any cricket. Everybody wants to bat first, and as soon as he is out, he pulls, unless you are the better wrestler. And while you are wrestling with him, the fielders have scattered to play at something else. The gardens are noted for two kinds of cricket: boy cricket, which is real cricket with a bat, and girl cricket, which is with a racket and the governess. Girls can't really play cricket, and when you are watching their futile efforts, you make funny sounds at them. Nevertheless, there was a very disagreeable incident one day when some forward girls challenged David's team, and a disturbing creature called Angela Clare sent down so many Yorkers that, however, instead of telling me the result of that regrettable match, I shall pass on hurriedly to the round pond, which is the wheel that keeps all the gardens going. It is round because it is in the very middle of the gardens, and when you are come to it, you never want to go any farther. You can't be good all the time at the round pond, however much you try. You can be good in the broad walk all the time, but not at the round pond. And the reason is that you forget, and when you remember, you are so wet, you may as well be wetter. There are men who sail boats on the round pond, such big boats that they bring them in barrows and sometimes in prams, and then the baby has to walk. The bow-legged children in the gardens are those who had to walk too soon because their fathers needed the pram. You always want to have a yacht to sail on the round pond, and in the end your uncle gives you one, and to carry it to the pond the first day is splendid. Also to talk about it to the boys who have no uncle is splendid, but soon you like to leave it at home, for the sweetest craft that slips her moorings in the round pond is what is called a stick boat, because she is rather like a stick until she is in the water and you are holding the string. Then, as you walk round, pulling her, you see little men running about her deck, and sails rise magically and catch the breeze, and you put in on dirty nights at snug harbors, which are unknown to the lordly yachts. Night passes in a twinkle, and again your rakish craft noses for the wind, whales spout. You glide over buried cities, and have brushes with pirates, and cast anchor on coral isles. You are a solitary boy, which all this is taking place. While all this is taking place, for two boys together cannot adventure far upon the round pond, and though you may talk to yourself throughout the voyage, giving orders and executing them with dispatch, you know not when it is time to go home, where you have been, or what sweater sails. Your treasure trove is all locked away in your hold, so to speak, which will be opened perhaps by another little boy many years afterwards. But those yachts have nothing in their holds. Does anyone return to this haunt of this youth because of the yachts that used to sail it? Oh no. It is the stick boat that is freighted with memories. The yachts are toys, their owner a fresh-water mariner. They can cross and recross a pond only while the stick boat goes to sea. You yachtsmen with your wands, you think we are all there to gaze on you. Your ships are only accidents of this place, and were they all to be boarded and sunk by the ducks, the real business of the round pond would be carried on as usual. Paths from everywhere crowd like children to the pond. Some of them are ordinary paths, which have a rail on each side, and are made by men with their coats off, but others are vagrants, wide at one spot, and at another so narrow that you can stand astride them. They are called paths that have made themselves, and David did wish he could see them doing it. But like all the most wonderful things that happen in the gardens, it is done, we concluded, at night after the gates are closed. Oh, have a good night, Cozy. Sleep well. We have also decided that the paths make themselves because it is their only chance of getting to the round pond. One of these wayward paths comes from the place where the sheep get their hair cut. When David shed his curls at the hairdresser's, I am told, he said goodbye to them without a tremor, though his mother has never been quite the same bright creature since. So he despises the sheep, as they run from their shearers, and calls out tauntingly, "Cowardly, cowardly custard!" But when the man grips them between his legs, David shakes a fist at him for using such big scissors. Another startling moment is when the man turns back the grimy wool from the sheep's shoulders, and they look suddenly like ladies in the stalls of a theatre. Sheep are so frightened by the shearing that it makes them quite white and thin, and as soon as they are set free, they begin to nibble the grass at once, quite anxiously, as if they feared that they would never be worth eating. David wonders whether they know each other now that they are so different, and if it makes them fight with the wrong ones. They are great fighters, and thus so unlike country sheep that every year they give my St. Bernard dog, Porthos, a shock. He can make a field of country sheep fly by, merely announcing his approach. But these town sheep come toward him with no promise of gentle entertainment, and then a light from last year's breaks upon Porthos. He cannot with dignity retreat, but he stops and looks about him as if lost in admiration of the scenery, and presently he strolls away with a fine indifference and a glint at me from the corner of his eye. Serpentine begins near here. It is a lovely lake, and there is a drowned forest at the bottom of it. If you peer over the edge, you can see the trees all growing upside down, and they say that at night there are also drowned stars in it. If so, Peter Pan sees them when he is sailing across the lake in the thrush's nest. A small part only of the Serpentine is in the gardens, for soon it passes beneath a bridge too far away to where the island is on which all the birds are born that become baby boys and girls. No one who is human, except Peter Pan, and he is only half human, can land on the island, but you may write what you want, boy or girl, dark or fair, on a piece of paper, and then twist it into the shape of a boat and slip it into the water, and it reaches Peter Pan's island after dark. We are on the way home now, though of course it is all pretense that we can go to so many places in one day. I should have had to be carrying David long ago, and resting on every seat like old Mr. Salford. That was what we called him, because he always talked to us of a lovely place called Stalford, where he had been born. Thank you for your lurk, Fairy. Enjoy your lurk. He was a crab apple of an old gentleman who wandered all day in the gardens, from seat to seat, trying to fall in with somebody who was acquainted with the town of Salford. And when we had known him for a year or more, we actually did meet another aged solitary who had once spent Saturday to Monday in Salford. He was meek and timid, and carried his address inside his hat, and whatever part of London he was in search of, he always went to Westminster Abbey first as a starting point. Him we carried in triumph to our other friend with the story of that Saturday to Monday, and never shall I forget the gloating joy with which Mr. Salford leapt at him. They have been cronies ever since, and I notice that Mr. Salford, who naturally does most of the talking, has tight grip of the other man's coat. The two last places before you come to our gate are the dog's cemetery and the chaffinch's nest, but we pretend not to know what the dog's cemetery is, as Porthos is always with us. The nest is set. It is quite white, and the way we found it was wonderful. Hmm, I'll answer in just a minute, okay, Fairy? We were having another look among the bushes for David's lost worsted ball, and instead of the ball we found a lovely nest made of the worsted and containing 4 eggs, with scratches on them, very like David's handwriting. So we think they must have been the mother's love letters to the little ones inside. Every day we were in the gardens, we paid a call at the nest, taking care that no cruel boy should see us, and we dropped crumbs, and soon the birds knew us as friends, and sat in the nest, looking at us kindly with her shoulders hunched up. But one day, when we were there were only 2 eggs in the nest, and the next time there were none. The saddest part of it was that the poor little chaffinch fluttered about the bushes, looking so reproachfully at us that we knew she thought we had done it. And though David tried to explain to her, it was so long since he had spoken the bird language that I fear she did not understand. He and I left the gardens that day with our knuckles in our eyes. Part 2. Peter Pan. If you are asking your mother whether she knew about Peter Pan when she was a little girl, she will say, "Why, of course I did, child." And if you ask her whether he rode on a goat in those days, she will say, "What a foolish question to ask. Certainly he did." Then if you ask your grandmother whether she knew about Peter Pan when she was a girl, she will also say, "Why, of course I did, child." But if you ask her whether he rode on a goat in those days, she says she never heard of his having a goat. Perhaps she has forgotten, just as sometimes she forgets your name and calls you Mildred, which is your mother's name. Still, she could hardly forget such an important thing as the goat. Therefore, there was no goat when your grandmother was a little girl. This shows that, in telling the story of Peter Pan, to begin with the goat, as most people do, is as silly as to put on your jacket before your vest. Of course, it is also shows that Peter is ever so old, but he is really always the same age, so that does not matter in the least. His age is 1 week, and though he was born so long ago, he has never had a birthday, nor is there the slightest chance of his ever having one. The reason is that he escaped from being a human when he was 7 days old. He escaped by the window and flew back to the Kensington Gardens. If you think he was the only baby who ever wanted to escape, it shows how completely you have forgotten your own young days. When David hears this story first, he's quite certain that he had never tried to escape, but I told him to think back hard, pressing his hands to his temples, and when he had done this hard and even harder, he distinctly remembered a youthful desire to return to the treetops, and with that memory came others, as that he had lain in bed planning to escape as soon as his mother was asleep, and how she had once caught him halfway up the chimney. All children could have such recollections if they would press their hands hard to their temples, for, having been birds before they were human, they are naturally a little wild during the first few weeks, and very itchy at the shoulders where their wings used to be. So David tells me. I ought to mention here that the following is our way with a story. First I tell it to him, and then he tells it to me, the understanding being that it is quite a different story, and then I retell it with his additions, and so we go on until no one could say whether it is more his or mine. In this story of Peter Pan, for instance, the bald narrative and most of the moral reflections are mine, though not all, for this boy can be a stern moralist. But the interesting bits about the ways and customs of babies in the bird stage are mostly reminiscence of David's, recalled by his pressing his hands to his temples and thinking hard. Well, Peter Pan got out by the window, which had no bars. Standing on the ledge, he could see trees far away, which were doubtless the Kensington Gardens, and the moment he saw them he entirely forgot that he was now a little boy in the nightgown, and away he flew right over the houses to the garden. It is wonderful that he could fly without wings, but the place itched tremendously, and perhaps we could all fly if we were as dead confident sure of our capacity to do it as was bold Peter Pan that evening. He alighted gaily on the open sards between the baby's palace and the Serpentine, and the first thing he did was to lie on his back and kick. He was quite unaware already that he had ever been human, and thought he was a bird even in appearance, just the same as his early days. And when he tried to catch a fly, he did not understand that the reason he missed it was because he had attempted to seize it with his hand, which, of course, a bird never does. Shall we continue? Peter tried it often, but always before he could kick out, he sank. What he really needed to know was how you could sit on the water without sinking, and they said it was quite impossible to explain such an easy thing as that. Occasionally, swans touched on the island, and he would give them all his day's food, and then ask them how they sat on the water. But as soon as he had no more to give them, the hateful things hissed at him and sailed away. Once he really thought he had discovered a way of reaching the gardens. A wonderful white thing, like a runaway newspaper, floated high over the island and then tumbled, rolling over its wing. He was so frightened that he hid, but the birds told him it was only a kite, and what a kite is, and that it must have tugged its string out of a boy's hand and soared away. After that, they laughed at Peter for being so fond of the kite. He loved it so much that he even slept with one hand on it, and I think this was pathetic and pretty, for the reason he loved it was because it had belonged to a real boy. To the birds, this was a very poor reason, but the older ones felt grateful to him at this time, because he had nursed a number of fledglings through the German measles, and they offered to show him how birds fly a kite. So 6 of them took the end of the string in their beaks and flew away with it, and to his amazement, it flew after them and went even higher as they did. Peter screeched out, "Do it again!" And with great good nature they did it several times, and always instead of thanking them, he cried, "Do it again," which shows that even now he had not quite forgotten what it was to be a boy. At last, with a grand design burning within his brave heart, he begged them to do it once more with him clinging to the tail. And now 100 flew off with the string, and Peter clung to the tail, meaning to drop off when he was over the gardens. But the kite broke into pieces in the air, and he would have been drowned in the Serpentine had he not caught hold of 2 indignant swans and made them carry him to the island. After this, the birds said that they would help him no more with this mad enterprise. Nevertheless, Peter reached the gardens at last by the help of Shelley's boat, as I am now to tell you. Part 3. The Thrush's Nest. Shelley was a young gentleman, and as grown up as he need ever expect to be. He was a poet, and they are never exactly grown up. They are people who despise money, except what you need for today, and he had all that and £5 over. So when he was walking in the Kensington garden, he made a paper boat of his banknote and sent it sailing on the Serpentine. It reached the island at night, and the lookout brought it to Solomon Caw, who thought at first that it was an unusual thing, perhaps a message from a lady saying she would be obliged if he could let her have a good one. They always asked for the best one he had, and if he likes the letter he sends one from class A, but if it ruffles him he sends very funny ones indeed. Sometimes he sends none at all, and at another time he sends a nestful. It all depends on the mood you catch him in. He likes you to leave it all to him, and if you mention particularly that you hope he will see his way to making it a boy this time, he is almost sure to send another girl. And whether you are a lady or only a little boy who wants a baby sister, always takes pains to write your address clearly. You can't think what a lot of babies Solomon has sent to the wrong houses. Shelley's boat, when opened, completely puzzled Solomon, and he took counsel of his assistants, who, having walked over it twice, first with their toes pointed out, and then with their toes pointed in, decided that it came from some greedy person who wanted 5. They thought this because there was a large 5 printed on it. Preposterous! Cried Solomon in a rage. He presented it to Peter. Anything useless which drifted upon the island was usually given to Peter as a plaything. But he did not play with his precious banknote, for he knew what it was at once, having been very observant during the week when he was an ordinary boy. With so much money, he reflected, he could surely at last contrive to reach the gardens, and he considered all the possible ways, and decided, wisely I think, to choose the best way. But first he had to tell the birds of the value of Shelley's boat, and though they were too honest to demand it back, he saw that they were galled, and they cast such black looks at Solomon, who was rather vain of his cleverness, that he flew away to the end of the island, and sat there very depressed, with his head buried in his wings. Now Peter knew that unless Solomon was on your side, you never got anything done for you in the island. So he followed him and tried to hearten him. Nor was this all that Peter did to gain the powerful old fellow's goodwill. You must know that Solomon had no intention of remaining in office all his life. He looked forward to retiring by and by, and devoting his green old age to a life of pleasure on a certain yew stump in the figs which had taken his fancy, and for years he had been quietly filling his stocking. It was a stocking belonging to some living person, which had been cast upon the island, and at the time I speak of it, contained 180 crumbs, 34 nuts, 16 crusts, a pen wiper, and a bootlace. When his stocking was full, Solomon calculated that he could be able to retire on a competency. Peter now gave him £1, cut it off his banknote with a sharp stick. This made Solomon his friend forever, and after the two had consulted together, they called a meeting of the thrushes. You will see presently why thrushes were only invited. The scheme to be put before them was really Peter's, but Solomon did most of the talking, because he soon became irritable if other people talked. He began by saying that he had been much impressed by the superior ingenuity shown by the thrushes in nest building, and this put them into good humor at once, as it was meant to do, for all the quarrels between birds are about the best way of building nests. Other birds, said Solomon, omitted to line their nests with mud, and as a result they did not hold water. There, he cocked his head, as if he had used an unanswerable argument, but unfortunately a Mrs. Finch had come to the meeting uninvited, and she squeaked out, "We don't build nests to hold water, but to hold eggs." And then the thrushes stopped cheering, and Solomon was so perplexed that he took several sips of water. "Consider," he said at last, "how warm the mud makes the nest." "Consider," cried Mrs. Finch, "that when water gets into the nest it remains there and your little ones are drowned." The thrushes begged Solomon with a look to say something crushing in reply to this, but again he was perplexed. "Try another drink," suggested Mrs. Finch pertly. Kate was her name, and all Kates are saucy. Solomon did try another drink, and it inspired him. "If," said he, "a finch's nest is placed on the Serpentine, it fills and breaks to pieces, but a thrush's nest is still as dry as the cup of a swan's back." How the thrushes applauded! Now they knew why they lined their nests with mud, and when Mrs. Finch called out, "We don't place our nests on the Serpentine," they did what they should have done first, chased her from the meeting. After this it was most orderly. What they had been brought together to hear, said Solomon, was this: their young friend, Peter Pan, as they well knew, wanted very much to be able to cross to the gardens, and he now proposed with their help to build a boat. At this the thrushes began to fidget, which made Peter tremble for his scheme. Solomon explained hastily that what he meant was not one of the cumbrous boats that humans used. The proposed boat was to be simply a thrush's nest large enough to hold Peter. But still, to Peter's agony, the thrushes were sulking. "We are very busy people," they grumbled, "and this would be a big job." "Quite so," said Solomon, "and of course Peter would not allow you to work for nothing. You must remember that he is now in comfortable circumstances, and he will pay you such wages as you have never been paid before. Peter Pan authorizes me to say that you shall all be paid 6 pence. I am reading my books specifically off of Project Gutenberg. If you want to ever get any freebies, that's the best place I suggest. But if you would like to help support me in my readings, I also have some affiliate links down below in the About section tab, and you can buy any of the books that I read there. I have suggestions too. But anyway, where did we leave off? Let's pick up where we went. Do your best, Cozy. I hope you get some sleep. Alrighty. Let us continue where we left off. Then all of the thrushes hopped for joy, and that very day was begun the celebrated building of the boat. All their ordinary business fell into arrears, It was the time of the year when they should have been pairing, and but not a thrush's nest was built except this one big one. And so Solomon soon ran short of thrushes with which to supply the demand from the mainland. The stout, rather greedy children, who look so well in prams but get puffed easily when they walk, were all young thrushes once, and ladies often asked specially for them. What do you think Solomon did? He sent over to the housetops for a little hut of sparrows and ordered them to lay their eggs in old thrushes' nests, and sent their young to the ladies, and swore they were all thrushes. It was known afterwards on the island as the Sparrows' Year, and so when you meet grown-up people in the gardens, puff and blow as if they thought themselves bigger than they are, very likely they belong to that year. You ask them. Peter was a just master and paid his workpeople every evening. They stood in rows on the branches, waiting politely while he cut the paper sixpences out of his banknote, and presently he called the roll, and then each bird, as the names were mentioned, flew down and got a sixpence. It must have been a fine sight. And at last, after months of labor, the boat was finished. Oh, the glory of Peter as he saw it growing more and more like a great thrush's nest. From the very beginning of the building of it, he slept by its side, and often woke up to say sweet things to it. And after it was lined with mud, and the mud had dried, he always slept in it. He sleeps in his nest still, and has a fascinating way of curling round in it, for it is just large enough to hold him comfortably when he curls round like a kitten. It is brown inside, of course, but outside it is mostly green, being woven of grasses and twigs. When these wither or snap, the walls are thatched afresh. There are also a few feathers here and there which came off the rushes while they were building. The other birds were extremely jealous, and said that the boat would not balance on the water, but it lay most beautifully steady. They said the water would come into it, but no water came into it. Next they said that Peter had no oars, and this caused the thrushes to look at each other in dismay. But Peter replied that he had no need of oars, he had a sail, and with such a proud, happy face, he produced a sail which he had fashioned out of his nightgown, and though it was still rather like a nightgown, it made a lovely sail. And that night, the moon being full and all the birds asleep, he did enter his coracle, as Master Francis Pretty would have said, and depart out of the island. And first, he knew not why, he looked upward with his hands clasped, and from that moment his eyes were pinned to the west. He had promised the thrushes to begin by making short voyages with them as his guides, but far away he saw the Kensington gardens beckoning to him beneath the bridge, and he could not wait. His face was flushed, but he never looked back. There was an exultation in his little breast that drove out fear. Was Peter the least gallant of the English mariners who have sailed westward to meet the unknown? At first his boat turned round and round, and he was driven back to the place of his starting, whereupon he shortened the sail by removing one of the sleeves, and was forthwith carried backwards by a contrary breeze, to his no small peril. He now let go the sail, with the result that he was drifted toward the far shore where black shadows he knew not the dangers of, but suspected them, and so once more hoisted his nightgown and went roamer of the shadows until he caught a favouring wind, which bore him westward, but at so great a speed that he was like to be broke against the bridge, which having avoided, he passed under the bridge and came, to his great rejoicing, within full sight of the delectable gardens. But having tried to cast anchor, which was a stone at the end of a piece of kite string, he found no bottom, and was fain to hold off, seeking for moorage. And feeling his way, he buffeted against the sunken reef that cast him overboard by the greatness of the shock, and he was near to being drowned, but clambered back into the vessel. There now arose a mighty storm, accompanied by a roaring of waters such as he had never heard the likes, and he was tossed this way and that, and his hands so numbed with the cold that he could not close them. Having escaped the danger of which, he was mercifully carried into a small bay, where his boat rode at peace. Nevertheless, he was not yet in safety, for, on pretending to disembark, he found a multitude of small people drawn up on the shore to contest his landing, and shouting shrilly to him to be off, for it was long past lockout time. This, with much brandishing of their holly leaves, and also a company of them carried an arrow which some boy had left in the gardens, and this they were prepared to use as a battering ram. Then Peter, who knew them for fairies, called out that he was not an ordinary human, and had no desire to do them displeasure, but to be their friend. Nevertheless, having found a jolly harbour, he was in no temper to draw off therefrom, and he warned them, if they sought to mischief him, to stand to their harms. So saying, he boldly leapt ashore, and they gathered round him with intent to slay him. But there then arose a great cry among the women, and it was because they had now observed that his sail was a baby's nightgown. Whereupon they straightway loved him, and grieved that their laps were too small, the which I cannot explain except by saying that such is the way of women. The men fairies now sheathed their weapons on observing the behaviour of their women, on whose intelligence they set a great store, and they led him civilly to their queen, who conferred upon him the courtesy of the gardens after lockout time, and henceforth Peter could go whither he chose, and the fairies had orders to put him in comfort. Such was his first voyage to the gardens. You may gather from the antiquity of the language that it took place a long time ago. But Peter never grows any older, and if we could be watching for him under the bridge tonight, but of course we can't, I dare say we should see him hoisting his nightgown, sailing or paddling towards us in the thrush's nest. When he sails, sits down, but he stands up to paddle. I shall tell you presently how he got his paddle. Long before the time for the opening of the gates he steals back to the island, for people must not see him. He is not so human as all that, but this gives him hours for play, and he plays exactly as real children play. At least he thinks so, and it is one of the pathetic things about him that he often plays quite wrongly. You see, he had no one to tell him how children really play, for the fairies are all more or less in hiding until dusk, and so know nothing. And though the birds pretended that they could tell him a great deal, when the time for telling came, it was wonderful how little they really knew. They told him the truth about hide and seek, and he often plays it by himself, but even the ducks on the round pond could not explain to him what it was that makes the pond so fascinating to boys. Every night the ducks have forgotten all the events of the day except the number of pieces of cake thrown to them. They are gloomy creatures and say that cake is not what it was in their young days. So Peter had to find out many things for himself. He often played ships at the round pond, but his ship was only a hoop which he had found on the grass. Of course, he had never seen a hoop, and he wondered what you play at with that, and decided that you play at pretending that they are boats. This hoop always sank at once, but he waded in for it, and sometimes he dragged it gleefully round the rim of the pond, and he was quite proud to think that he had discovered what boys do with hoops. Another time, when he found a child's pail, he thought it was for sitting in, and he sat so hard in it that he could scarcely get out of it. Also, he found a balloon. It was bobbing about on the hump, quite as if it was having a game by itself, and he caught it after an exciting chase, but he thought it was a ball, and Jenny Wren had told him that boys kick balls, so he kicked it, and after that he could not find it anywhere. Perhaps the most surprising thing he found was a pram. It was under a lime tree, near the entrance to the Fairy Queen's winter palace, which is within the circle of the 7 Spanish chestnuts. And Peter approached it warily, for the birds had never mentioned such things to him. Lest it was alive, he addressed it politely, and then, as it gave no answer, he went nearer and felt it cautiously. He gave it a little push, and it ran from him, which made him think it must be alive after all. But as it had run from him, he was not afraid, so he stretched out his hand to pull it to him. But this time it ran at him. He was so alarmed that he leapt the railing and scudded away to his boat. You must not think, however, that he was a coward, for he came back the next night with a crust in one hand and a stick in the other, but the pram had gone, and he never saw any other one. I have promised to tell you also about his paddle. It was a child's spade, which he had found near St. Govor's Well, and he thought it was a paddle. Do you pity Peter Pan for making these mistakes? If so, I think it rather silly of you. What I mean is that, of course, one must pity him now and then, but to pity him all the time would be impertinence. You thought he had the most splendid time in the gardens, and to think you have it is almost quite as good as really to have it. He played without ceasing, while you often waste time by being mad dog or merry Anish. He could be neither of those things, for he had never heard of them. But do you think he is to be pitied for that? Oh, he was merry. He was as much merrier than you, for instance, as you are merrier than your father. Sometimes he fell like a spinning top from sheer merriment. Have you seen a greyhound leaping the fences of the gardens? That is how Peter leaps them. And think of the music of his pipes. Gentlemen who walk home at night write to the papers to say they heard a nightingale in the gardens, but it is really Peter's pipes they hear. Of course, he had no mother. At least, what use was she to him? You can be sorry for him for that, but don't be too sorry, for the next thing I mean to tell you is how he revisited her. It was the fairies who gave him the chance. Part 4. Lockout time. Let's see where we left off next. Oh yes, I remember now. It is frightfully difficult to know much about fairies, and almost The only thing to know certain is that there are fairies wherever there are children. Long ago, children were forbidden in the gardens, and at that time there was not a fairy in the place. Then the children were admitted, and the fairies came trooping in that very evening. They can't resist following children, but you seldom see them, partly because they live in the daytime behind the railings, where you are not allowed to go, and also partly because they are so cunning. They are not a bit cunning after lockout, but until lockout, my word. When you were a bird, you knew the fairies pretty well, but you remember a good deal about them in your babyhood, which it is a great pity you can't write down, for gradually you forget. And I have heard of children who declared they had never once seen a fairy. Very likely, if they said this in the Kensington gardens, they were standing looking at a fairy all the time. The reason they were cheated was that she pretended to be something else. This is one of their best tricks. They usually pretend to be flowers because the court sits in the fairy's basin, and there are so many flowers there, and all along the baby walk, that a flower is the thing least likely to attract attention. They dress exactly like flowers and change with the seasons, putting on white when lilies are in, and blue for the bluebells, and so on. They like crocuses and hyacinth time best of all, as they are partial to a bit of color. But tulips, except white ones, which are the fairy's cradle, they consider garish, and they sometimes put off dressing like tulips for days, so that the beginning of the tulip week is almost the best time to catch them. When they think you are not looking, they skip along pretty lively, but if you look, they hide, and they fear there is no time to hide. They stand quite still, pretending to be flowers. Then, after you have passed without knowing that they were fairies, they rush home and tell their mothers they have had such an adventure. The fairy basin, you remember, is all covered with ground ivy, from which they make their castor oil, with flowers growing in it here and there. Most of them really are flowers, but some of them are fairies. Never can be sure of them, but a good plan is to walk by looking the other way, and then turn around sharply. Another good plan, which David and I sometimes follow, is to stare them down. After a long time, they can't help winking, and then you know that they are fairies. There are also numbers of them along the baby walk, which is a famous gentle place, as spots frequented by fairies are called. Once 24 of them had an extraordinary adventure. They were a girls' school out for a walk with the governess, and all wearing hyacinth gowns. She suddenly put a finger to her mouth, and then stood all still on the empty bed and pretended to be Hyacinth. Unfortunately, what the governess had heard was two gardeners coming to plant new flowers in that very bed. They were wheeling a hand cart with the flowers in it, and were quite surprised to find the bed occupied. Pity to lift them, hyacinths, said the one man. Duke's orders, replied the other, and, having emptied the cart, they dug up the boarding school and put the poor terrified things in it in 5 rows. Of course, neither the governess nor the girls dare let on that they were fairies, so they were carted far away to a potting shed out of which they escaped in the night without their shoes. But there was a great row about it among the parents, and the school was ruined. As for their houses, it is no use looking for them, because they are exactly opposite of our houses. You can see our houses by day, but you can't see them by dark. Well, you can see their houses by dark, but you can't see them by day, for they are the color of night. And I never heard of anyone yet who could see night in daytime. This does not mean that they are black, for night has colors just as day has, but ever so much brighter. Their blues and reds and greens are like ours, with a light behind them. The palace is entirely built of many colored glasses, and it is quite the loveliest of all royal residences. But the queen sometimes complains because the common people peep in to see what she is doing. They are very inquisitive folk and press quite hard against the glass, and that is why their noses are mostly stubby. The streets are miles long and very twisty, and have paths on each side made of bright worsted. The birds used to steal the worsted for their nests, but a policeman has been appointed to hold on at the other end. One of the great differences between the fairies and us is that they never do anything useful. When the first baby laughed for the first time, his laugh broke into a million pieces, and they all went skipping about. That was the beginning of fairies. They look tremendously busy, you know, as if they had not a moment to spare. But if you were to ask them what they are doing, they could not tell you in the least. They are frightfully ignorant, and everything they do is make believe. They have a postman, but he never calls except at Christmas with his little box, and though they have beautiful schools, nothing is taught in them. The youngest child, being chief person, is always elected mistress, and when she has called the roll, they all go out for a walk and never come back. It is a very noticeable thing that in fairy families the youngest is always the chief person, and usually becomes a prince or princess. And children remember this and think it must be so among humans too. But that is why they are often made uneasy when they come upon their mother furtively putting new frills on the bassinet. You have probably observed that your baby sister wants to do all sorts of things that your mother and her nurse want her not to do, to stand up at sitting down time, and to sit down at standing up time, for instance, or to wake up when she should fall asleep, or to crawl on the floor when she is wearing her best frock, and so on. And perhaps you put this down to naughtiness, but it is not. It is simply that she is doing as she has seen the fairies do. She begins by following their ways, and it takes about 2 years to get her to the human ways. Her fits of passion, which are awful to behold, are usually called teething, are no such thing. They are her natural exasperations, because we don't understand her. Though she is talking an intelligible language, she is talking fairy. The reason mothers and nurses know what her remarks mean before other people know is that good means give it to me at once, while wah is why do you wear such a funny hat? Is because mixing so much with babies, they have picked up a little bit of the fairy language. Of late, David has been thinking back hard about the fairy tongue, with his hands clutching his temples, and he has remembered a number of their phrases, which I shall tell you some day if I don't forget. He had heard them in the days when he was a thrush, And though I suggest to him that perhaps it is really bird language he is remembering, he says not, for these phrases are about fun and adventures, and birds talked of nothing but nest building. He distinctly remembers that the birds used to go from spot to spot like ladies at shop windows, looking at the different nests and saying, "Not my color, my dear," and "How would that do? The soft lining, but will it wear?" and "What a hideous trimming," and so on. The fairies are quite exquisite dancers, and that is why one of the first things the baby does is to sign to you to dance to him, and then to cry when you do it. They hold their great balls in the open air, in what is called a fairy ring. For weeks afterwards you can see the ring on the grass. It is not there when they begin, but they make it by waltzing around and around. Sometimes you will find mushrooms inside the ring, and these are fairy chairs that the servants have forgotten to clear away. The chairs and the rings are the only telltale marks that this little people leave behind them, and they would remove even these were they not so fond of dancing that they tow it till the very moment of the opening of the gate. David and I once found a fairy ring quite warm. But there is also a way of finding out about the ball before it takes place. You know the boards which tell at what time the gardens are to close today? Well, these tricky fairies sometimes slightly change the boards on a ball night, so that it says the gardens are to close at 6:30, for instance, instead of at 7. This enables them to begin a half hour early. If on such a night we could remain behind in the gardens, as the famous Mamie Mannering did, we might see delicious sights. Hundreds of lovely fairies hastening to the ball, the married ones wearing their wedding rings round their waists, gentlemen all in uniform holding up the ladies' trains, and linkamen running in front carrying winter cherries, which are the fairy lanterns. The cloak-room where they put on their silver slippers and get a ticket for their wraps. The flowers streaming up from the baby walk to look on, and always welcome because they can lead a pin. The supper table with Queen Mab at the head of it, and behind her chair the Lord Chamberlain, who carries a dandelion on which he blows when Her Majesty wants to know the time. The tablecloth varies according to the seasons, and in May it is made of chestnut blossom. The way the fairy servants do is this: the men, scores of them, climb up the trees and shake the branches, and the blossom falls like snow. Then the lady servants sweep it together by whisking their skirts until it is exactly like a tablecloth, and that is how they get their tablecloth. They have real glasses and real wine of 3 kinds, namely blackthorn wine, berberis wine, and cowslip wine, and the queen pours out, but the bottles are so heavy that she just pretends to pour it out. There is bread and butter to begin with, of the size of a 3-penny bit. To end with, and they are so small that they have no crumbs. The fairies sit round on mushrooms, and at first they are well behaved, and always cough off the table, and so on. But after a bit they are not so well behaved, and stick their fingers into the butter, which is got from the root of old trees, and the really horrid ones crawl over the tablecloth, chasing sugar or other delicacies with their tongues. When the queen sees them doing this, she signs to the servants to wash up and put away, and then everybody adjourns to the dance, the queen walking in front, while the Lord Chamberlain walks behind her, carrying two little pots, one of which contains the juice of wallflower, and the other the juice of Solomon's seal. Wallflower juice is good for reviving dancers who fall to the ground in a fit, and Solomon's seal juice is for bruises. They bruise very easily, and when Peter plays faster and faster, they foot it till they fall down in fits. For as you know, without my telling you, Peter Pan is the fairies' orchestra. He sits in the middle of the ring, and they would never dream of having a smart dance nowadays without him. P. P. is written on the corner of the invitation cards sent out by all really good families. They are grateful little people too, and the princesses coming of age ball. They come of age on their second birthday and have a birthday every month. They gave him the wish of his heart. I think we will stop there. We've gone over a little bit.